So with the recent conclusion of the finals closed qualifiers for the Grand Majors in both EU and NA, I've actually now signed with the team Pulsar in NA as their coach. Following this, I actually reached out to Artie, who coaches Team Secret and also cast the Pro Leagues himself, to discuss the APAC games, which, to simplify, essentially means the Korean and the Chinese region and their pro qualifiers going into the majors. I wanted to explore their region and see just how different they play the finals, only to find out it gets much weirder than I ever expected. To tackle this new region, Artie and I are both going to be covering it. I will be focusing mainly on the loadouts that they use, explaining how they even got to that meta, and how to effectively use them. If you want more detail on which teams qualified, and more details on the pro scene in general, I definitely recommend Artie go check out his channel and his video. Now let's cover the Korean qualifiers. First, starting with how the league works. In Korea, they have bans. So this means that they get to ban specializations, gadgets, and weapons. So this obviously leads to some of their metas, and pros often banning similar things end up making them practice these off-meta loadouts with anticipation of other teams banning it. It leads to a lot more variety, and I think it is very exciting to watch. Another thing to note is the qualifiers for Korea was played in Season 7. So balancing would differ versus the NA in EU, which was played in Season 8. But we'll eventually get to their current day loadouts and look at where their meta has formed. All coverage that I've watched in Korea was basically just strictly 3v3 final rounds. China did have some cash out games to watch, but it gets a bit weirder than just cash out. So let's skip ahead to the majors qualifying game, the Final Descendants, which has been further changed to FN Esports, but for this, I'm going to be calling them TFE for simplicity. They end up facing Honey Badger. Now, during Game 1, Honey Badger banned Dematerializer, Pike, Glitch Mines, and then TFD banned Dash, 8 plus Infuser, and the KS-23. Obviously, the bans on TFD stand out from our EU and NA metas, especially during Season 7. Obviously, most of the time, these bans are meant to target enemy teams or to facilitate their own strategies and playstyles better, but it seems odd at first glance, but it gets weirder as the games go on. Next, for composition, we have Honey Badger playing HML. No surprise, and the TFD team composition is MMH. Potentially due to the Dash and Infuser bans, maybe they just value light less, but when we get to their loadouts, some things just surprise me even more. On Honey Badger, we saw heavy on Charge, Akimbo, Dome Shield, Lockbolt, and Barricade. So there is no RPG, no C4. It seems the Charge is the stall tool, and Lockbolt, Barricade, and Dome provide a ton of self-sustain and defensive options. Deagles provide decent range, while all the defensive options allow the players to stay at range, but still Charge allows them to have that close range comfort. Now the medium use Healing Beam, Revolver, Data Reshaper, Jump Pad, and Defibrillator. I think this loadout is pretty standard minus the Revolver, which is certainly not as common, but we are seeing a little bit more of it in recent meta. Maybe Korea was the first ones to innovate here. Data Reshaper seems odd, but it will make sense later. For the light, we have a shocking pick of Grappling Hook, which from what I've seen, even without dash bans, Grappling Hook is an extremely popular pick in the Asian regions. You will almost always find the light on rooftops beaming down with their ARN 220. For gadgets, the light use Nullifier, a gadget I don't think I've ever even seen used seriously in the NA or EU competitive scene, the Sonar Grenade, and Gateway. Sonars make a lot of sense for the Season 7 meta, so outside of the Nullifier, which I theorize could be something that they just hopped on, since it was newly reworked around the time, since this isn't a common trend. Now let's look at the loadouts on TFD. For heavy, we have Charge and Slam again, and at this point, I am becoming very confused. Not using Winch into a Charge and Slam meta just kind of makes zero sense to me. I understand you can charge after being winched, but Winch can instantly cancel a Charge and Slam. It is well known as a very good counter to Charge, so the fact both teams favored Charge and Slam, and in fact both regions of China and Korea seem to really favor Charge, is just quite odd to me. I understand Winch is a bit complicated, but it brings a ton of value. For weapon choice, they use Akimbo Deagles and gadgets for Healing Emitter, RPG, and Dome. Nothing too abnormal here. It seems like a well-rounded long-range poke and defense choice. With some good range power comes the close range power of Charge and Slam, so overall a pretty decent selection here. The first medium build that was used was Guardian Turret. Yes, Guardian Turret being used in Pro Play actually happened. This was paired with Revolver, Grenade, Jump Pad, and Defibrillator. Outside of the turret, this loadout isn't too far from the ordinary, but it becomes weird when you notice the other medium on the team is also using turret. A double turret team in the pro scene was definitely not on my bingo card. For weapon, they actually used FAMAS, and for gadgets, they brought Zipline, Jump Pad, and Defib. Overall, I think the main differences I see in this region metas tend to be around specializations, as their gadgets do kind of match what we do. My guess is that within the pro scene of NA and EU, you'd probably have to ban every single heavy spec before you get any of them on charge. You'd also likely have to ban both Dash and Cloak in order to get the lights on grapple. And you'd honestly probably just have to ban light before you get teams to not run light. While these compositions were fascinating, I think we need to break down some of the logic behind the double turret strategy here. So keep in mind, Pike and DMAT were banned, so all they really had was heal and turret. So doubling up was clearly a choice for the turret. When combined with a revolver, this means the turret basically just has to hit one shot, and it can reduce the shots to kill in the revolver by 1. So the revolver does make sense in this synergy. The gadgets are pretty standard across the board, and Zipline being brought here when you have no light makes a lot of sense in order to get the team around. FAMAS is a really solid pick, so I think to avoid leaving enemies at 1 HP if you're to run double revolver, I feel like the FAMAS kind of makes sense and rounds out the build a little bit more. Or maybe this is just personal preferences. With no healing beam or infuser, they opted for the healing emitter on a heavy to help round out the team, and they had a bunch of defensive options with Grenade, Barricade, Dome, the 2 turrets, a healing emitter, so they can actually set up some insane defensive strongholds. They even used turret at the edge of Hospital, and it was able to lock onto targets across the gap, something I was unaware of. However, in my own testing with the turret, it doesn't seem to have that kind of range. I believe verticality affects it to some degree, but I'm definitely going to have to test this myself. Now for game 2, the final match, we saw various shifts. When Charge and Slam was banned, players swapped to Winch. When DMAT wasn't banned, the players played DMAT instead of turret or heal. When Revolver was banned, we saw some interesting picks. AK came out, which isn't too surprising, but we saw Riot Shield on Team Honey Badger, and they paired it with Proximity Sensor. Now, I believe the theory was it's a solution to the pikes that show up when Revolver isn't banned. However, the Riot Shield player did actually perform quite poorly. They lost that game, and throughout game 2, there wasn't anything outside of those examples for things out of the ordinary, at least for what we would expect in NA and EU, where we saw DMAT and Winch very often. For game 3, I feel like I'm at a loss. Honey Badger, outside of their normal bans, actually banned Cloak. Yes, they banned Cloak versus a team that was running double medium heavy. TFD banned Mesh, KS-23, and Vanish Bomb. Again, I'm confused as Honey Badger wasn't really using any Mesh or KS-23 or really utilizing heavy picks that would warrant these types of bans. So when I was watching it at this point, I was pretty confused, but surely they know something I don't. The Vanish Bomb does make sense since the light on Honey Badger in the previous round was using Vanish Bomb. But the light that played in round 3 was actually a different light being subbed in, opting for Dash now since it was free. Surprisingly, Honey Badger won this game. Potentially the new light and added threat of a Dash player was the reason why TFD ended up failing this round. Now for game 4, Honey Badger banning Cloak and SA-12, my assumption was going into Las Vegas they were worried of the closer range threats, which is why we see SA-12 Cloak honestly still evading me, as again TFD has still not really been using light. They might know some sort of history here that I don't. TFD again banned Mesh and Vanish. Surprising to not see the Dash ban, but maybe this is a map Honey Badger uses Mesh on when given the chance. Loadouts here barely changed at all from previous games, and the only notable change was the addition of gas mines on the medium. In map 5 of Monaco, we saw some new adaptations. Honey Badger now dropping their light pick for a double medium strat, and with Charge and Slam banned, we saw Mesh on Honey Badger's heavy. Dome Shield and C4 saw bans, which really make these building fights change drastically. No good form of drop outside of DMAT, and no Dome Shield means these Monaco building cash outs were chaotic. Honey Badger won that game, and going into game 6, we saw Honey Badger fully target banning the heavy with Healing Emitter, Deagles, and Charge and Slam, finally trying to put a stop to the heavy who have been such a huge threat on TFD. Interestingly though, the heavy on TFD actually swapped to SA-12, Winch, RPG, Lockbolt, and Barricade. Given the fact Dome Shield was banned, this actually is pretty similar to the EU and NA meta loadouts, so I found this actually really fascinating. to see that their value within the meta seems to be pretty similar to ours, but they just seem to value a couple things above what we would consider meta. Honey Badger's heavy was opting for Mesh Shield, which is clearly a comfortable pick and makes sense why TFD was banning it so often in the previous matches. Another thing is seeing both teams stick with no light. Double medium here being the choice, even though Infuser wasn't banned, so it seems clear to me that they don't see light as a valuable pick. It was really interesting seeing 4 dematerializers during a 3v3. In a final game, all tied up 3-3, we saw the heavy on Honey Badger finally pull out the KS-23 paired with Mesh Shield. For their gadgets, they had RPG, C4, and Dome Shield. It was interesting to see these bans throughout the tourney from TFD as a counter to the enemy heavy, and then to release those bans right at the end, clearly needing to swap up their strategy and their approach, opting for Winch, Lockbolt, RPG, Dome, and the Shack to round it out, becoming an extremely scary type of brawler. I think as a way to attempt to counter the enemy heavy, preventing movement and winching, counter mesh, it was a really exciting match to watch. Now TFD ended up winning the game and ended up being the Korean team to make it to majors. Now let's get into China and their games played qualifiers. There were 2 teams that made it, and I don't want to spend too much time repeating some of the similarities, but let's cover some of the loadouts and metas we saw during those games. Again, keep in mind China does play on a different version of the game with different balancing. However, for these games, they were on a global version, again taking place during Season 7. More common trends that we saw, again, was around Charge and Slam. But we do see Winch being picked up. There are no bans here. At least the ones I watched, I didn't see any bans, and the lights that I did see very often use grapple over anything. But like Korea, we saw plenty of teams opt for using 2 mediums instead of a light. Tracking Dart was also a surprising choice on one of the lights that ended up being a qualifying team. For loadouts, we saw a lot of the standard meta loadouts, with a few tweaks like Zipline being popular on mediums, especially when running 2 mediums. One often needs to bring it. Now, if you guys recall my Asian heavy meta video, there was actually one particular heavy that I studied mostly in the China region, and that is somebody named BZ, and they utilized that same loadout to very good effect. And we also saw a Winch, we also saw iron sights on a Shack, Barricade, RPG, and Dome, which is uncommon, but certainly not out of the ordinary. The weird part being the iron-sighted Shack. Now this next part is where the region gets very different from EU and NA, and it revolves around the fact that they play quick cash in tournament play. On one hand, I think it's a horrible idea because third partying is basically everywhere, but on the other hand, it kind of makes sense for the same reason. If everyone has to focus on winning a cash out, then there isn't really griefing. You can only grief yourself because you have to be first. And I think because it's quick cash, we saw some pretty weird loadouts. We also saw a team of 2 competing. If I understood the videos, maybe I could explain why, but my guess is that someone just crashed or didn't show up. We saw a player use proximity sensor, DMAT, and FCAR, which I can see the value in proximity sensor during quick cash, since it's all third partying. It's certainly a very logical choice. We saw Mesh and Charge again. We aren't seeing much Winch here. It's honestly shocking given this was actually played during Season 7, where Winch was even stronger than it is now, and we basically only use Winch in pro play, with the odd goo gun here and there. In Asia, we mainly saw Charge and Slam with some Mesh. I'm sure the balancing devs are scratching their heads here, trying to figure out what is even going on, because I'm in the same boat. We also saw good old Smoke Thermal being played. Good to know every region was able to use it while it lasted. We still saw cash out play though, and in those games we saw a lot of what you'd expect at this point. 4 Charge and Slam players, less than 4 lights. In fact, only 2 lights in some games, often dash or grapple. A lot of dematerializer, plenty of teams opting for bringing 2 DMATs plus a Charge and Slam player. So basically walls just don't stand a chance in this region. Now, something I found very exciting as a result within the Chinese region is Team DRG. They are actually the main team I used to study when I wanted to learn this region's meta back in the day. The heavy on this team is very, very scary. He is insanely quick and snappy, uses Charge and Slam plus the SA-12 like a demon. The medium opts for Zipline over Goo, and their light uses Grappling Hook through and through. This team is extremely fast. They basically have a composition that is all about speed. They are players with fast reactions, and I'm really excited to see such a different type of meta when it comes to the majors. This is a wildcard team, and I am so excited to watch them play when it comes to the majors. Kingzone, being the other team that qualified in the region, often opted for double medium and heavy like we saw in the Korea qualifiers, but they seem to favor Winchclaw now that we've moved into Season 8, and there's been balance changes since these tournaments have concluded, and it's been a little bit hard to find any recent pro play from some of these regions, but what I have seen from Korea is banning a lot of the normal picks that we see in NA and EU now. So that would be BFR, Dome Shield, Winch, Dash, Famas, Glitchnade, Shack, Goo, etc., etc. But we will still see the popularity of Charge and Slam in this region. It's still very popular and it still gets some bans. It seems Charge and Winch are the two dominant heavy specs in the recent matches that I've seen, and most matches I watch are actually still double medium and heavy, with mediums using one heal and one DMAP. Shockingly, I even saw a Gravity Vortex ban, but I'm guessing the dash bans are preventing that pick anyways. We also see that they do often pick Light with Grappling Hook when they get to play Light. Probably due to the dash ban, but overall loadouts and bans seem to be getting closer to NA and EU's metas. But when we saw DMAP banned for TFD, which is now currently FN Esports, they actually used turret instead of heal beam, so I'm still hopeful to see some turret and some off-meta shenanigans when it comes to the majors. Now, as I mentioned before, RD's video is going to be covering a little bit more details and breakdown about the APAC games. Throw him a sub if you're not already, and if you enjoyed this video, why not throw a sub my way? Thank you to all my members. I'm really excited to see the majors. If the closed qualifiers from every region was this cinema, then surely the majors is going to be as well. This game gives you a ton of tools to shape your own playstyle, so lock in on what you want to play, master it, and I will see you in the finals.